Here we go. Today is Sunday, November 25th. That's 1 month from Christmas. That's crazy. 2018, and this is episode 229 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry. How are you, sir?
I'm really good. How are you?
I am good. Did you have a good Thanksgiving?
I did. It was great. My oldest son came back from college and spent the day with us, or actually spent the weekend with us. So it was a good time, nice and relaxing. How about you?
It was good, but you didn't move without telling him while he was away at college? I thought that's what all parents did. Just mine?
I think that was just yours, yes.
Huh. Well, otherwise, no, mine was great. Thank you. Ate too much, took a nap. It was good times.
Good deal. So just a reminder before we get into stories that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers, and that remains true always and forever. So anyway, let's get into some stories. So some kind of news of the weird, I would say, this week. First up is a story from DutchNews.nl. The title is Internet Conmen Ripped Off Path NL for 19 million euros in sophisticated fraud. Now, that alone isn't terribly innovative or surprising. What was surprising is that two executives at this, what apparently is a theater chain, were actually dismissed. And by the way, that's pretty. I think it's a pretty high bar in Europe to be terminated with cause. So, anyway, this appears to be a pretty standard business email compromise type scam. There's a little bit of detail missing, but apparently the corporate CEO's email was faked, and by the way, it's not really clear if it was done as a result of the CEO's email getting compromised or if it was spoofed. But anyway, this I guess it's a subsidiary or a branch office, really a little bit unclear, ended up over the course of about 2 weeks paying close to 20 million euros to some scammers, using the kind of the old trope of, we're buying a company in Dubai and you can't tell anybody. Now, this all came to light because one of the two people who were fired actually filed a lawsuit, and I guess I'm not sure. I don't remember if it was the man or the woman, right? But
lawsuit for wrongful termination, basically?
Wrongful termination. Now, they apparently got, it was a mixed judgment as far as I can tell. They got back pay from, I guess they were terminated back in March of 2018, and the court decided that the company had to pay them through, or pay this person through December 1st. So
yeah, I did think it was interesting that people got fired over it. And, the defense is what we often sort of talk about sometimes in these cases, which is that this was a sophisticated attack, that, this was an advanced criminal organization, and that anybody would have fallen for this, et cetera, et cetera. But it was an interesting attack where they got the original email asking for 826,000 euro. And then it follow on with another transfer of 2.5 million euro, and then a third and a fourth payment. Overall, just shy or just over 19 million euro before sort of the parent company or somebody else figured it out and started looking into it and saying, "Hey, what's going on?" And it's the typical, hey, you can't tell anybody. This has to be confidential. I and I alone will notify the affected parties in due time. So that power of the CEO being used to garner reaction from the people that they're targeting. So it's, fairly typical, but just walking through for those who haven't heard it much or seen it much. But yeah, that these two guys were fired. One's fighting it is interesting.
Yeah. So I don't think the other one was fighting it, but the only reason this came to light was because this person actually filed a wrongful termination suit, and so some details were released that probably wouldn't otherwise have been released.
Yeah, and I tried to look at the court documents, but they were in a foreign language I couldn't read, and Google failed me.
Probably Dutch. Yeah,
that would make sense.
Yeah,
we talked about this a little bit too in previous, shows and talks of how to defend against this, and I think, just to quickly sum up, it's really having strong processes that even the CEO's word can't change easily. I think one of the only ways you can really counter this, and make sure that even the CEO has to follow the process.
Yeah, exactly. It really creates these kind of scams, I think, create some pretty strong internal conflict with the victims because it's the CEO or someone purporting to be the CEO, saying basically giving a direct order and
right.
You're effectively
on penalty of job loss.
Yeah,
almost.
Right. You're basically telling the CEO, no, I'm not going to follow your instructions, and that's so in a way you're kind of is damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like if it is the CEO, you're going to raise the ire of of the chief executive of the company you work for, and if it's not, you're at risk of being fired. So it's a really difficult position, and I think you're right. This has to be overtly handled. I mean, people have to understand that they can say no to the CEO in circumstances like this, and they'll be okay. I mean, otherwise, I think they're going to be conflicted, and people will continue to fall for this.
Yeah, it's a tough. It's why it works. It's why it's a very effective campaign. It's really targeting some very innate, sophisticated psychological weaknesses that we have of following authority orders and understanding that certain types of business transactions need to be private and quiet. And so I think the time to figure this out is typically, as they say, in peacetime, when you're not in the middle of one of these. And also talk to your folks and say, hey, if you ever suspect that something isn't right, foster the environment to do a sanity check in some alternative communication methodology. Yeah,
the unfortunate part of this is that I bet you most companies don't really think about this. It doesn't even pop up on their radar as a threat until after it's happened.
Right.
And so hopefully people listening to the show, will take this as a lesson if you haven't already, and do something with it in your organization. But it's an interesting thing, and I wonder if over time, corporate auditors, third party auditing companies like KPMG and Deloitte and PwC and whatnot ought to provide that kind of guidance. So this is really. It again, it's not a problem until it's a problem, and so it's out of sight, out of mind, and it certainly is something that needs to be taken seriously. But like you said, who's going to focus on this in peacetime? If they haven't actually had it happen to them, that's the
well, we're seeing a rise in this, right? We're seeing a clear trend that this is starting to become a more favored attack type.
Absolutely.
Because it's effective and it works, and it nets big money when it works.
Absolutely. 20 million euros. That's a crap load of money. Big payday.
Yeah. So, and we really only know about this probably because of the lawsuit. It very well could be happening and not being reported.
Yeah, especially if the companies are private, that this probably happens far more than we actually understand. So... Anyhow, work on those processes. So next story comes from Lifehacker. I think this may be the first Lifehacker post we've talked about. The title is "How Password Constraints Give You a False Sense of Security." I was conflicted about including this one, but this comes up quite a lot. There's a whole lot of debate about passwords. There's some recent news about how Microsoft is very, not even slowly, is pretty rapidly moving away from passwords to biometrics, and I think they just declared support for U2F, the Universal Second Factor, and devices and whatnot. So passwords, I think, are kind of a hot topic in general in the security industry, and this is one of those deals where I think Troy I think it's Troy Hunt he's the person who runs the Have I Been Pwned website, where you can figure out if your email address has been involved in a data breach. His view, and I certainly agree with this, is that passwords are going to be with us for a long, long time. They're kind of the least common denominator for just security. I mean, there's a whole lot of institutional inertia and IT inertia behind the use of passwords. And so anyway, the point of this, I'd sum it up as saying a lot of the things that we do in security and in IT to try to force passwords to be more complex actually works against us. And so, as an example, they talk about when you force a password to be at least 8 characters long, you take away a huge potential space that an attacker would have to search, right? So an attacker doesn't actually have to try a 1 through a 7-character password.
Right.
So that they just right off the bat, they know that they don't have to do that. They don't have to look in that space. And then anytime you inject an additional requirement, like let's say 1 capital letter, a number, a special character, those also narrow the space of guesses, right? So, but the I would say the one problem I had with this article is that brute forcing passwords, kind of counterintuitively, doesn't really happen in this way, right? I mean, in general, password attacks don't happen by trying, A, B, that's not how password guessing attacks work these days. Typically, the way it's done is you have a massive dictionary built with, all kinds of...
Yes, I do.
Previously stolen passwords, and then you run a dictionary attack, right? And then you substitute different, you add numbers to the front and to the end, and then you substitute different letters with the the kind of the leet speak, the $ for the S and whatnot.
Yeah, there are known algorithms, and it's easy. Right.
That's how a lot of these password brute force attacks work these days. And actually, it's I would say in contemporary times, it's even gotten stranger than that. We're now onto this credential stuffing where they'll actually take just raw passwords out of these password dumps, and rather than trying to break into one particular account, they'll, let's say, go to Facebook. I'll just pick on Facebook, and there's 1 billion accounts. Well, they'll try, let's say, 3 or 4 different passwords on 1 billion accounts. Well, those passwords are going to work on some percentage of the 1 billion accounts, and that's how a lot of account takeovers happen. That's how a lot of email accounts are compromised. The ones, I should say, that are not the result of password reuse. So I still think, this is kind of an interesting. This article is kind of an interesting discussion, but it's a little bit academic, because I think that in general the biggest problems we have are password reuse and Well, I guess really it's password reuse.
I completely agree. This is also why I really push back against people adopting the new NIST recommendations of you don't need to change your password anymore if it's sufficiently complex. The problem I have with that is people reuse the same password over and over again. So that only, in my mind, that only works as if A, it's a complete unique password and it's of sufficient complexity, and you've got brute force detection and sort of timeout-based lockouts of people trying to do brute forces, and you can completely secure your database of passwords so it can never be, brute forced offline. So there's a lot of assumptions that go into that, and I think that's why I think it's dangerous, because I think most people use the same password over and over again. So assuming that a third-party site gets popped, they probably have the same email address or very close to other other sites, and they have the same password. So I don't necessarily need to pop your Facebook. I can go pop your Instagram somehow. And that, like you said, that email and username and password probably apply over there. So I think, again, that as we've said so many times, I feel like a broken record. And they mentioned in this article, too, to be fair, a password manager generating completely random complex passwords unique to every site, I think is your best defense on this one, and or two-factor.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another story that came out over the past week or so, and we didn't include it in this week's show, but it was another one of those articles digging on millennials, right? And it was I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was a significant percentage of millennials interviewed by this group, and I think it was, of course, a study done by a provider of identity and access management stuff. But they found that a very large percentage of their interviewees in the 18 to 25 age group used the same password on work accounts as they do on personal accounts. And that, I think, goes to your point. You're never required on some periodic basis to change your Facebook password. Right, so your Facebook password could stay the same forever. Well, adopting the new NIST guidance, I think, kind of aids and abets the whole concept of using the same password, just like you said, the same password on both work accounts and personal accounts, which I think is a very dangerous thing. And minimally, if you're requiring those password changes, you really can't get away with that for very long, at least.
Right. Yeah, it's a tough problem. I think really the solution is going to a solid two-factor. And I know people get into the whole SMS is too weak debate. I get it. I'm not going to get into that debate here. I think just like passwords, it's probably not going away. It's too much momentum for that. It's too ingrained.
Right.
But I do think we're going to see some more cheaper alternative standards that will come out soon that might make sense. We're starting to get there. But again, this still comes back to these companies who have to employ this technology, realize that this is a burden or a perceived burden on their users. And there's an engagement friction that they're trying to avoid. Mm-hmm. So if we apply too much password or authentication friction to an encounter and an engagement with our users, there will be a certain percentage who will no longer use that service. Yeah. And that is the counter of that argument that business executives are constantly balancing. Now, if you're internal at a business, it's a little bit different. But if you're talking about why doesn't Facebook enforce this for everybody, that's part of the equation.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And by the way, I think that's one of the reasons Microsoft is moving so swiftly away from from static passwords, because of this very thing. There is a recognition that even within an organization where you wouldn't think that the whole concept of friction is a big problem, that actually is a big problem, especially in some of the high tech companies. Where you want to retain good talent, you want to keep. There's a lot of focus on employee satisfaction and whatnot. So I think that is a positive trend as long as it's implemented in a sane and secure way. But in the meantime, like I said, I still don't think even with that said, passwords in general are going to be with us for the foreseeable future. I have to imagine I'll be retired by the time we which I guess won't be all that long. But
we is old.
Yeah, it's true. Getting older every day. It's a situation where we're going to be using password for a long time, so we need to come up with a reasonably safe way. I think personally, password managers are assuming you can't use two-factor, right? Password managers with unique passwords complex and unique passwords per site or per service is the way to go. They're so damn easy these days. There's no excuse to not use them anymore.
Well, a lot of people argue that's a concentration of risk, and now I just have to pop the password manager. I get that argument. I think it's an edge case. I think it's still worth the risk. I think the net gain in security at this point, everything I see, I can be proven wrong. The net gain of security of having unique randomized passwords per site with a password manager is higher than the risk imposed by the centralization of all my passwords.
It's kind of like saying, well, I don't wear my seatbelt because, if I end up in a certain kind of crash, that my car's on fire and, my seatbelt will prevent me from escaping. Well, yeah, it could happen. But it's far more likely it's going to save your bacon. So, by the way, I will say another thing. I actually am a proponent, and I know this is revolutionary and draconian, and probably wildly unpopular. But I think services should generate passwords for people that you then have to store in your password manager. So you don't get.
Wait, what? No. See, no.
Yep.
But now they know what my password is. There's nothing that stops them from capturing that when they generate it for me.
Yep. But if you change your password, you're giving it to them anyway.
Well, okay, true.
So, I mean, I don't think it's that. I mean, it is a.
Now, what if the site gets lazy and issues the same complex password for everybody?
Well, I'm not saying it's a perfect idea.
I know, I'm just being silly, but
right, but I mean, there certainly are some downsides.
Explain yourself, sir. Explain yourself. Why do you think this is a good idea? Because this is just contrarian.
Well, I think it's a good idea because it forces people to use a password manager. If every service that you,
because it's not memorizable.
Exactly.
Now, what's the effect on their call center going to be when people forget this and forget to write it down, and they write it down wrong, and then they can't get back in?
I mean, like I said, it's not a perfect idea.
And how do I integrate a password manager with my main OS login?
Well, I mean, the password that may not apply everywhere, right? I mean, so it's not. For instance, it's not going to apply to log into your password manager, right?
Right.
So there. I mean, there's certainly going to be cases where it won't make sense, but I think just in general, the more I think about it, the more I like it. It's and by the way, if you want to view it as kind of more of the like the nudge type view, you could have it generate the password automatically, and then you could override it if you wanted to. You could pick your own crappy password. So kind of like like I said, kind of the nudge thing, where they automatically sign you up for your 401k retirement deposit by default, and you can opt out, but that kind of thing.
It's an interesting idea. I will ponder this craziness you speak of.
All right. Okay, so moving on to the next story. This is on CSO Online. It's actually, I guess, like an op-ed. The title is "The End of Security as We Know It." I think this is the person who had a bad experience. So,
can you point out on the CSO dial where the vendor management people touched you?
Yeah. So the author here points out that a quote large cloud hosting provider apparently it has a scheme now where they are in their contracts not permitting they are reserving the right. I should say that differently. They're reserving the right to delegate and subcontract work at their own discretion, and they are not providing you, the customer, with audit rights or guarantees of that subcontractor. So there's no kind of pass through, so to speak. And so in this particular case, this person is alleging, and they don't mention which company is doing this. I'm assuming that he calls it the ABC Web cloud hosting company. So I'm assuming that's going to be AWS, but I don't know. Say that they have a web portal where you can go in and see the name of the vendor who's subcontracted, who is subcontracted to perform some activity, and then you can try to work with that subcontractor. But the problem is, as he points out, you the customer have no contractual relationship with that subcontractor, so you have nothing. There's no legal relationship, between. So
because cloud provider, well, we're just going to assume it's AWS for the sake of this conversation, okay? And I might be wrong, caveat, but it's easier to just say AWS. So AWS is subbing out stuff, and because you don't have a direct relationship, you can't do third-party vendor risk management of any variety.
That's the allegation.
And that's a big deal?
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. So typically, and by the way, this person goes on to describe what a normal vendor management program looks like. There's typically three key components, which is due diligence, and so your ability under this kind of agreement to perform due diligence has been stripped because your provider has unilateral authority to go in and engage this subcontractor. Now, by the way, that is not permitted under the GDPR. So that's kind of interesting.
To sub?
It's not to sub without explicit permission and consent of the data controller. So
per subcontracting situation, or just as a blanket, yes, you can subcontract?
Per subcontracting company.
Oh
yeah.
That's a
Yeah. It's one of the provisions in the law. So it's causing a lot of consternation, I'll say that. But
yeah. So I got to admit, this feels like a very large company problem, not a medium and small company problem. I don't think a lot of medium and small companies are doing a ton of due diligence at the level that this matters.
I don't think so, and it's also not clear exactly what kinds of services are being outsourced, right? I mean, now certainly, for instance, you wouldn't expect to be able to sign off on what kind of janitorial service,
right?
Your cloud hosting provider uses.
At some point, there's a level of trust that you're putting into a third-party vendor.
Correct. Yes.
For them to do their job properly, and you're somewhat trusting that if they've been successful in the free market and lots of other people are using them, that they probably are not bad at whatever subbing they're doing.
And by the way, another way to look at this is if you, I think you hit the nail on the head. This probably is a larger company issue. Because you're right. A lot of smaller companies aren't going to go off and they're not going to do, show me your ISO 27001 cert or whatever. But the larger companies certainly will. And kind of what this tells me is that the provider that they are talking about here probably is not really interested in that type of market, right? And so they're kind of doing the take it or leave it, The provider is, I should say, is saying, take it or leave it.
Sure. And if it turns out that there's enough pushback from very desirable customers, maybe they'll come up with a different model.
Yeah, and by the way, if you are, it's not a one-way street here, because if you are a massive cloud hosting provider, with tens of or hundreds of thousands of customers is completely unworkable. To think that if you're going to try to subcontract something out, that you got to go and get permission, consent from every single one of your customers.
Well, that's a very good point that you make too, because this is sort of the model that I think the technology industry is moving towards, not away from.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this author's pointing out this is one of the unintended potential negative side effects, but I don't think you're going to stop this train. I think that corporate risk boards are probably going to have to find a way to swallow this. They're not going to like it, though. But I don't see it changing.
No, and I certainly think as IT continues to consolidate into a smaller number of large organizations, and we are actually seeing that already. It's AWS and Azure and and others. These are becoming the large kind of large utility providers for IT, and as more and more of that that business goes there, I think the economics of them kind of placating individual customers starts to get smaller and smaller. So I don't know where it ends, and I do think that the author here points to a kind of a systemic issue, but I think that in the near term, probably even in the medium term, you can mitigate this by going to different providers. I mean, let's look at it from a hardware manufacturing standpoint. If I'm going to buy Cisco routers, I'm not getting into a whole bunch of discussions with them about how they sub out and who makes their components and how those components are made and who sub. Yeah. Right.
So is this a silly thing to begin with? Are we wasting a whole bunch of people's time trying to do this sort of corporate governance?
In a way, yes, and in a way, no. I mean, so think about one of the big trends in risk management these days, and that is, third-party risk. So think about the Target, Home Depot, OPM.
Okay, agreed. But is this a lipstick on a pig sort of situation? Is this still, we have third-party risk, we have supply chain risk, but is this actually doing anything to fix the problem? Or is it hiring a bunch of auditors, and again, this is a large company issue, hiring a bunch of auditors to run a bunch of paperwork that chews up a whole bunch of resources and time, and the vendors are saying basically what the customers want to hear anyway.
Yeah.
And
fair enough.
is there any value?
Wrong. You're not wrong. I'm not sure there is, but at the same time, I think a lot of this is a legal kabuki dance. Because it's a deal where everybody's trying to show that they acted responsibly.
They did their due diligence
to
a reasonable level.
Correct. And so if you don't do all that pointless paperwork, low value paperwork, then if something bad happens, you don't have a leg to stand on to say that, well, look, it wasn't us, it was our cloud provider. Well, the cloud provider is going to come back, or the victim's going to come back and say, yeah, but what kind of due diligence and monitoring did you do of that supplier? Like, how did you get comfortable that they were doing the right stuff?
They were in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Come on.
Yeah, well, hey, maybe there's a new avenue of litigation that's been untapped.
We trusted Gartner, and look what happened to us.
Exactly.
I'm not picking on Gartner. They're well known.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting question, but so I think that's the fundamental challenge is that companies I don't think reap a lot of tangible value from those vendor management practices because it is just a kabuki dance, but at the same time I think they do reap some legal value.
That's interesting. I don't know. You may be right.
So anyway, but point of point of the article is, or the piece here is, things are changing, and to your point, we do have to figure out what's our response going to be. Is our providers start taking our ability to oversee them away?
And I guess the other aspect of this is something goes tragically wrong, and lawsuits spin up. Who can you sue?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And by the way, part of being able to sue is demonstrating that the other party acted in bad faith and whatnot. So, anyway, moving on to the next story. This one comes from careersinfosecurity.com. I guess that's one of the many brands of the health info security and bank info security and whatever infosecurity.com network that they have. The title is Breach Settlement Has Unusual Penalty. Pretty interesting story. We talked about this particular breach at the time. There was a company called Virtua Medical. I don't remember the full name of them, but this is a medical provider in New Jersey. This provider outsourced to a company called Best Medical Transcription, based in Georgia, I think.
What was it really the best?
As it turns out, no. So Best Medical Transcription, and then apparently in turn engaged another third party. Now, as an astute listener may realize, healthcare provider outsourcing medical transcription services is going to certainly be a HIPAA relevant type service, and you have to have a business associate agreement. Well, I'll cut to the chase. Best Medical Transcription screwed up in a bunch of different ways. The owner apparently made a change to the website where these transcription, the transcribed files and the audio recordings were hosted during an upgrade, and it resulted in all that data being publicly accessible. It was indexed by Google, and
interestingly, it was on an open FTP site, and Google still is indexing FTP sites.
Correct.
Which I was unaware of, that they were still doing that.
Absolutely. Fascinating. So, again, that was several years ago. I assume they still do, but in any event, this Virtua, the actual healthcare provider, ended up getting fined by the Attorney General of New Jersey, and then they actually also went after this Best Medical Transcription for a number of different violations, mostly of HIPAA. And one of them, by the way, was that they didn't in turn have a business associate agreement with their with this subcontractor in India. So that was kind of interesting. They didn't perform risk assessment, and they screwed up in the first place. But in addition to a $200,000 fine that this company had to pay, the owner of Best Medical Transcription is barred from operating a business in the state of New Jersey.
Wow. Which
is really fascinating. And that's kind of the I'd say the lead in this story is that, this, I had never heard of this kind of sanction before, but yeah, this person is not permitted to own a business. He's not permitted to own more than 10% of common or of any type of stock of any New Jersey-based company. He can't be on the board of directors of a New Jersey-based company, and a bunch of other related restrictions.
I mean, that smacks of serious ethics concerns.
Yes.
Right, as opposed to a technical mistake.
Correct.
Right? This is, we don't feel you're ethically moral enough to, that's probably not the appropriate term, but, we don't trust you to ever run a business in our state ever again. Get out.
Yeah. Clearly, my read of this was, we really wish we could put you in jail,
Mm-hmm.
but apparently there was nothing in criminal in that direction that would allow that. So, but you're right. This is an odd and heavy-handed sanction, and the article does point out that this is not completely a one-off. There apparently were some other similar kinds of cases, although I would say the other cases that they referenced were more that the company, like an insurance company, was barred from doing business in a particular state for a period of time as a settlement for some wrongdoing. But I didn't read anything where a specific person was barred from owning or running a business in a particular state. So, really interesting stuff. It kind of goes back to we have to act ethically in IT and in IT security, and B, as time goes on, the legal landscape continues to evolve, and businesses and leadership of businesses can be held personally accountable. I mean, there's been a whole bunch of cases recently, like with Equifax, two directors or executives or managers are being tried. I think one was sentenced for insider trading, and so the tolerance for shenanigans in IT is certainly coming down. And also this is what I infer as a trend of holding individual people accountable. So interesting stuff.
I think if we ever go into business together, we should use the word shenanigans somewhere in our business name.
I think that's a great idea.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
All right.
I'll have to think about that.
Yeah. So the next story comes from Motherboard, and the title here is "Massive Data Leaks Keep Happening Because Big Companies Can Afford to Lose Your Data." So this is I would say an overly cynical look at why companies are continuing to experience data breaches, and the long and the short of this article is, well, it's not economically painful to avoid breaches, and therefore companies that don't have a strong incentive to
it's more expensive to avoid it than allow it to happen.
Right, exactly. Better, well said, yes.
Yeah, and kind of like that scene from Fight Club when they're talking about what motivates auto companies to do a recall, if anybody recalls that scene. But yes, to your point, I've never been in a conversation where someone has said to me, it's cheaper if we let this breach happen than to secure it. We'll take that risk. Now, to be fair, it's never that black and white. There's far more that goes into that decision, in at least my experience. But go on with your summary. Sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that is the long and the short of the article. It goes on and adds a lot of detail about the Ponemon cost of a breach survey, which I continue to have concerns with. That they indicate that the average cost per data breach globally is $3.86 million. That's
per individual breach.
Yeah, per individual breach. In the U.S., that's the global number. In the U.S., the average is $7.91 million. The problem with, just to go off on a slight tangent, the problem with this number is the same problem you would have if, let's say, Bill Gates or I guess we have to substitute Bill Gates with what's his name from Amazon. Damn it.
Jeff Bezos?
Jeff Bezos, thank you. I'm getting old. So it's a problem if Jeff Bezos, lived on your block. Obviously you wouldn't, right? But somebody asks you, what's the average income of people on your block, well, he's going to totally skew the average. And so that's the problem with this, right? It's when you have a bunch of probably really inexpensive breaches, and then you have a couple that are super expensive, the average comes out to be inordinately high. I'll say that. So I don't think the average is actually that high. I think the average is the breach, the cost of a breach that most companies are most likely to have to incur is going to be significantly lower than that.
Yeah,
which by the way doesn't help the story any, right? Because this just means that it's even more financially. Companies have a financial disincentive, I think, to spend too much on security because it's it's not that painful. And so that's why, by the way, why I think we see laws like GDPR and like the new EU NIS and the new California data breach law, and I think we're going to continue to see those because they're, in the absence of what I'll call free market forces penalizing companies, governments are going to step in and do that for them. Now, I think there's a fundamental question if what is the real harm to a person if they continue to do business with a company that's lost their data?
This gets into really weird sort of game theory around economic incentives and disincentives, and this gets really esoteric very quick. Now, you know me, I'm a free market guy. I prefer that over government regulations most of the time. But I think the problem is the free market moves slower than most people want it to move. Companies aren't punished fast enough, and the government clearly moves much faster than the free market in many cases. So,
yeah,
I have trouble with this article. I think, like anything, a company has to find the right balance of how much to spend and where and how to spend that money to mitigate risk. But they can never get to zero risk. You can't get to zero risk and do business. So you can also overspend on risk mitigation, and you want to be efficient with your resources. You're trying to make money and employ people and ultimately be a profitable business. So, and there's no perfect solution. If there were a perfect solution, we wouldn't have this massive industry of random people trying to come up with random solutions to all these new and emerging problems every day. So it's not as black and white, I think, as a lot of people want to think it is. But I don't know. I'm pretty cynical. I'm not this cynical. I will tell you, though, that it usually comes down to we know how to secure things, but the cost, whether it be in terms of business flexibility, in terms of real dollar cost, in terms of what else do I want to impact to users, usually exceeds the value. Again, when you get it's like a hockey stick curve, or I should say a chart where it curves upwards dramatically as you get closer to zero risk. The cost to increment less risk goes up dramatically each step you get closer to zero risk. And there is a sweet spot that I think companies are always trying to find in an environment that is dynamic and ever changing.
Yeah. So I think that the thing that is different here is that there's a delineation between a company losing, let's say, its intellectual property and the personal data of its customers, right? Because the one is an asset that harms them if they mishandle it, and the other is an asset that doesn't harm them if they mishandle it. I mean, it doesn't harm them directly, right? It's they don't lose a competitive advantage if Equifax structurally didn't lose any. The value of their company, the value of their intellectual property and what they do didn't decrease when they lost all of that data.
Well, potentially their contracts with third parties might have been impacted, which future revenue growth is impacted, which can.
Correct, and I guess you're right. You're right. I guess what I'm saying is their
book value didn't change.
Correct. Right. The assets they hold didn't go down. They didn't. They weren't robbed of money. They don't have to go and recreate some new some intellectual property that is now out in the open, and they have to reestablish their market dominance or what have you. And that's so the only person or the only group that's harmed directly is the individual people whose data they quote mishandled. And I think that's where I think a lot of people have misgivings, and so it in a way it's kind of like thinking about a bank or an investment house, but rather than it being money that the money of individual people, it's their personal data, and so I think we would be intolerant of a company mishandling our bank or an investment company mishandling our investments.
So we don't value PI very high?
I think that's the kind of the fundamental, and I'm struggling to put this into words. It's kind of coming to me as I'm talking here, but I think that's the fundamental analogy here is that in the case of banks and investment companies, there's a lot of regulation on how you have to handle that money and how you have to protect that money and whatnot. And that same sort of regulation that scheme just doesn't exist in the world of personal data. But the harm and consistently, right? Right. But the harm to individual people is not completely unlike, having money taken away from you. In all cases, I mean, in some cases it's not. I mean, like if your credit card gets stolen in the U.S., and this varies by country, I understand, but in the U.S., if your credit card gets stolen, it's a hassle, but it's not really a financial loss to you, right? It ends up being a financial loss to somebody, but it isn't to you. And so right. When we saw, for instance, in the wake of the Target breach, there was all sorts of outrage. We're never going to shop at. I mean, I remember seeing all these interviews on TV. We're never going to shop at Target again. And then, the next weekend, Target offered like 10% discount as an apology. And I gotta believe that they probably lost very few customers.
So what you're saying is, if I need something on sale at Target, I should conduct another big breach?
Well, I mean, that was basically what I was saying. Yeah. Long way of getting there, but anyway, I think we just don't have the economics of this correct. You made a comment that I think is really important to understand. I don't think organizations, despite what a lot of people think, I don't think really any organization, maybe that one guy we talked about earlier, notwithstanding, I don't think we really see organizations trying to intentionally short shrift security. I think it's largely done out of ignorance and false senses of security and lack of creativity and not keeping up with the times and underinvestment and kicking the can down the road and all those sorts of things, and bureaucratic processes like we saw with I think we saw with Equifax, where your processes aren't robust, and so is that a case where they they shirked their responsibility because they thought it was cheaper to to not patch that one server? I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think anybody intentionally said don't patch it.
Right.
It's usually a consequence of a long series of other unrelated decisions.
Right. And I think those decisions, in large part, happen completely divorced of any conception of the risk. Like I just don't think that anybody's thinking, well, nobody in general, and I got to believe in Equifax in particular, is thinking as they're designing their processes and their audit programs and their patching programs and their vulnerability scanning programs, if I set this setting, what is the likelihood that I'm going to incur this massive data breach? That's not how. Maybe it should, but at the end of the day, we have to get stuff done, and IT stuff has to work, and we make these trade-offs, I think, and a lot of times we don't understand the implications. So,
very true. Very true.
All right, so moving on to the last story. This one comes from ZDNet. Title is City of Valdez, Alaska admits to paying off ransomware infection. So, kind of interesting story. This city had 27 servers and 170 PCs infected by the Hermes ransomware. And they hired a third-party company in Virginia. I'm going to guess somebody like BAE probably. And they negotiated the cost down to $26,000, almost just under $27,000. Which is an interesting thing, and I'm going to go out on a limb and infer that they didn't have backups. And the reason I say that, I say that is that they are still bringing up their systems one at a time with the
scrubbing them
and scrubbing them, and then next year, they said in 2019, they're going to go through and do a more methodical replacement of the systems that were infected to make sure that they're no longer infected with anything else. Which, by the way, I think is the right way to do it. When I read that wording, I've long said, if you have a system that's infected, you've got it. You can't trust that thing anymore. It's got to be
burn
taken
it to
off
the ground.
And
but here's the other thing too: is what about the systems around it? If it ever comes back on the network or was on the network, I think it's a little naive to say that it's isolated to just those systems based on the IOCs they've detected. But this starts to get paranoid and crazy in a hurry. But
I agree, and by the way, this is my love of Active Directory all over again. You're on an important point that figuring out the edges of where an incident has propagated in the environment is sometimes more art than science. So
right.
Anyway, so. I think that that this story kind of indicates that they didn't have backups to fall back to, and so they're, this does not appear to be a situation where they determined that paying the ransom was the shortest path to getting back up and running. This certainly seems to me like they didn't have backups, and but
this was the only path.
Yeah, that's kind of my.
So,
my read.
To be clear, I'm not condemning them for paying the ransom. I know some people say that you should never do it. I've come across a lot of cases where it makes sense. It sucks. It's not ideal, but it may make sense. So I think it's easy to judge when you're out in the middle of the situation. But I think that we have covered a number of situations where it may be the right thing to do in the short term. Yeah,
well, I think even the FBI has issued kind of conflicted messages about this. It basically said you shouldn't pay the ransom, but we kind of understand that there may be circumstances where you don't have a choice, and I'm going to guess that this is probably one of those circumstances. But again, you got to do what you got to do. It is unfortunate because typically that you're just propagating the problem. You're you're funding future bad activity. So
yeah. Ideally, you don't want to pay it, right? And there's no guarantee that you're necessarily going to get your data back.
Correct. And then, do you become a favored target of opportunity for people? Once you've paid, are you now in the little black book of targets?
Well, one would hope that if you pay, you understand the root cause of the initial compromise and you fix it. But sure.
Yeah. So they later in the article, they do go on to talk about how there was some concern that there may be a targeted campaign against government agencies in this particular part of Alaska. But upon further investigation, there were different types of ransomware affecting different jurisdictions in the same area, apparently by different actors. But the person they interviewed here did say that they believe that most of these were the result of the Emotet infection, which we actually talked about, I think, on the last show. This is, again, where kind of coming back to a lot of this cybercrime stuff is becoming industrialized, and there's an initial hook to get something like Emotet installed in organizations, and then access to that is auctioned off. And some people will install Hermes, and some people will install, SamSam, and some people will install something else. So, that this is, I often hear though, why me? Why would, why would a bad actor want to come after, my little city? Well, the reality is, you're just there. Somebody in that government agency managed to get themselves infected. They showed up on a dashboard as available to purchase, and bing, bang, boom, there you go. I mean, it's nothing personal, just business. So, and by the way, I think that model of economics in cybercrime is becoming more common. I'm seeing it happening more and more, and it's concerning because it allows everybody to specialize in that right. attack chain. The person or group who's getting that initial foothold, they can do it in any number of different ways, whether it's through an open RDP server with a weak password, or whether it's through a phishing email or a watering hole attack. They just have to get that initial foothold, and then they can go off and sell that access to whoever will pay for it. And you could very well end up with some kind of lame ass initial intrusion being leveraged by some sophisticated nation state. So watch out. So, anyway, anything more you wanted to say on that one?
No, I think we've covered it pretty extensively. Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Well, that's the show for today. Happy belated Thanksgiving to everybody in the U.S. The holidays are upon us once again. Thanks to our Patreon donors. You can just a reminder, you can find links to the stories we talked about today on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow Mr. Callett on Twitter at Lurg. You can follow me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And with that, we'll talk again hopefully next week.
Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.